Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover that every person you've ever respected, every leader you've ever admired, and every moral figure you've ever looked up to has been operating by a completely different set of rules than the ones they publicly preach. Imagine learning that while you've been playing checkers with the rulebook of ethics and morality, they've been playing chess with a manual written in shadows, one that teaches the art of political power through deception, manipulation, and calculated cruelty. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the dark truth that Machiavelli unveiled 5 centuries ago when he wrote The Prince, and it's been hiding in plain sight ever since. You see, there exists a fundamental split in human nature that most people never recognize. On one side, we have the world of appearances, the realm where we speak of honor, justice, and moral philosophy. This is the world your parents taught you to navigate, the world your teachers praised, the world that makes you feel good about yourself when you follow its rules. But beneath this surface lies another world entirely, one governed by what Machiavelli called effectual truth. The brutal reality of how power dynamics actually work, how influence is genuinely wielded, and how those who shape our world truly operate through realpolitik. Here's what's deeply unsettling. While you've been conditioned to believe that good people finish first, that honesty is the best policy, and that virtue will be rewarded, those who hold real political power have been operating by an entirely different silent code. They understand leadership strategies that the masses never learn, that the person who appears most virtuous may be the most calculating, that the leader who speaks most passionately about justice may be the most willing to commit injustice when convenient, and that the individual who projects the greatest moral authority may have mastered the art of moral flexibility. This creates a psychological tension that most people spend their entire lives trying to resolve. You want to believe in the goodness of human nature, in the power of righteousness, in the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. Yet everywhere you look, you see evidence that contradicts this belief. The most successful politicians seem to be the most skilled liars. The wealthiest business people appear to be those most willing to exploit others. The most influential leaders often seem to be those who've mastered the art of saying one thing while doing another, navigating ethical dilemmas with ruthless pragmatism. But here's the question that will haunt you. What if this isn't a bug in the system? What if it's a feature? What if the world isn't broken because bad people have corrupted it? But rather, what if you've been operating with a fundamentally flawed understanding of how human nature actually works? Machiavelli didn't invent this dark reality. He simply had the courage to describe it through historical analysis and unflinching observation. He observed that there are 2 kinds of people in this world: those who understand the true nature of power and those who remain blissfully ignorant of it. The first group shapes history, builds empires, and determines the fate of nations. The second group gets shaped, gets conquered, and has their fate determined for them. Consider this: every time you felt confused by political events, every time you've wondered how obviously corrupt individuals rise to positions of authority, every time you've been baffled by the success of people who seem to lack basic moral principles, you've been brushing up against Machiavelli's silent code. You've been sensing the existence of this hidden operating system that governs human behavior, but you've never been given the tools to understand its ethical implications or navigate its complexities. The uncomfortable truth is that while you've been taught to see the world through the lens of how things should be, power operates according to how things actually are. While you've been conditioned to believe that people are fundamentally good and that evil is an aberration, Machiavelli understood that human beings are fundamentally self-interested creatures capable of both tremendous virtue and terrible vice, and that successful leaders must be prepared to navigate both extremes using sophisticated leadership strategies. This isn't about becoming a monster. This isn't about abandoning your moral compass or embracing cynicism. This is about understanding a reality that has been deliberately hidden from you, a reality that explains why the world often seems so chaotic, why justice often seems elusive, and why good intentions so frequently lead to disastrous outcomes when they collide with power dynamics. The question that will determine the trajectory of your life is this: will you continue to operate according to the comfortable illusions you've been fed, or will you have the courage to understand the world as it truly is? Will you remain among those who are perpetually confused by the gap between ideals and reality, or will you join those who understand how to navigate that gap effectively using the insights of political philosophy? Because once you understand Machiavelli's code, you can never unsee it. Once you recognize the patterns of power that surround you, you can never pretend they don't exist. The only question is whether you'll use this knowledge to become a more effective force for whatever values you hold dear, or whether you'll allow others to continue operating by rules you don't even know exist. The choice is yours. But first, You need to understand why this hidden knowledge has remained hidden for so long, and why most people are psychologically incapable of accepting what Machiavelli revealed about the true nature of human power. The reason Machiavelli's insights remain hidden isn't because they're complex or difficult to understand. It's because accepting them requires you to confront a psychological reality that most people would rather die than acknowledge. That the moral framework you've built your entire identity around may be nothing more than a comforting illusion designed to keep you compliant and predictable. Think about this for a moment. From the time you could speak, you were taught that good behavior gets rewarded and bad behavior gets punished. You were told that if you work hard, tell the truth, and treat people fairly, success would naturally follow. This creates what psychologists call a just world fallacy. The desperate need to believe that the universe operates according to moral principles, that virtue leads to reward and vice leads to punishment. But Machiavelli understood something that modern psychology has confirmed. Human beings don't make decisions based on moral reasoning. They make decisions based on self-interest, then create moral justifications afterward. The Prince wasn't just a manual for rulers, it was a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truth about how all humans actually operate when the stakes are high enough. Consider the psychological concept of cognitive dissonance. When reality contradicts our beliefs, our minds don't update our beliefs to match reality. They distort reality to preserve our beliefs. So when you see corrupt politicians winning elections, dishonest businesspeople accumulating wealth, or manipulative individuals rising to positions of influence, your mind performs mental gymnastics to explain these observations without challenging your fundamental worldview. This is where Machiavelli's political philosophy becomes revolutionary. He didn't just describe how power works. He explained why most people can never see it clearly. The very moral education that makes you feel good about yourself also blinds you to the leadership strategies that actually determine outcomes in the real world. The hidden problem runs even deeper than individual psychology. Our entire social structure depends on most people never understanding these power dynamics. If everyone recognized the silent code that governs human behavior, if everyone understood the ethical implications of true leadership strategies, the current system would collapse overnight. The comfortable lies that keep society stable would crumble, and chaos would follow. This is why Machiavelli's work has been consistently misrepresented throughout history. Scholars, politicians, and moral authorities have spent centuries trying to paint him as evil, as corrupt, as someone promoting immorality. But this misrepresentation serves a crucial function. It protects the masses from truths they're not psychologically equipped to handle while ensuring that only a select few understand the real rules of power. The psychological roots of this blindness go back to our earliest evolutionary programming. Humans survived as a species by living in groups, and group survival required social cooperation. Those who appeared trustworthy, moral, and altruistic were more likely to be accepted by the tribe and more likely to reproduce. Over millennia, we developed an instinct to present ourselves as moral beings and to prefer leaders who project moral authority. But here's the cruel irony that Machiavelli recognized. The very qualities that make someone appear moral and trustworthy, kindness, honesty, consistency, are often liabilities when it comes to wielding power effectively. Real political power requires flexibility, strategic deception, and the willingness to make decisions that serve long-term objectives even when they violate short-term moral preferences. This creates what philosophers call the moral political tension. Those who are genuinely moral often lack the strategic ruthlessness necessary to gain power, while those who possess the skills to gain power often lack genuine moral constraints. Machiavelli saw this clearly and concluded that effective leaders must be able to access both modes of being, appearing moral when it serves their purposes, but acting immorally when morality would lead to failure. The psychological discomfort this creates is enormous. It forces you to accept that the world isn't fair, that virtue doesn't guarantee reward, that the people you admire may be skilled actors, and that your moral intuitions may be evolutionary artifacts that no longer serve your best interests in a complex modern world. Most people resolve this discomfort by simply refusing to see it. They create elaborate mental defenses, surround themselves with like-minded individuals, and construct worldviews that filter out evidence contradicting their moral beliefs. They choose comfortable delusion over uncomfortable truth. But some individuals, those who truly want to understand power dynamics and political philosophy, are willing to sit with this discomfort. They're willing to question everything they've been taught about how the world works. They're willing to consider that Machiavelli wasn't describing how things should be, but how things actually are. This is the first step toward real understanding. Accepting that your moral framework might be a psychological comfort blanket rather than an accurate description of reality. Once you're willing to consider this possibility, you can begin to see the hidden patterns that govern human behavior, the leadership strategies that actually work, and the ethical dilemmas that real power creates. The question becomes, are you psychologically strong enough to handle this level of truth? Are you willing to trade the comfort of moral certainty for the clarity of accurate perception? Because once you begin to see the world through Machiavelli's eyes, there's no going back to innocent moral assumptions about how power operates. Now that you understand why this knowledge remains hidden, you need to grasp the full scope of how your ignorance has been weaponized against you. Every day, people who understand Machiavelli's principles are making decisions that shape your life, your opportunities, and your future, while you remain blissfully unaware of the strategic calculations determining your fate. Consider your workplace. While you focus on doing good work and being a team player, others are building strategic alliances, managing perceptions, and positioning themselves for advancement through careful political maneuvering. They understand that competence alone never guarantees promotion, that visibility often matters more than ability, and that the appearance of leadership can be more valuable than actual leadership skills. You've been conditioned to see this as office politics, something distasteful that good people avoid. But this perspective keeps you powerless. Those who understand power dynamics don't see politics as separate from work. They see it as the essential skill that determines who gets to make decisions and who gets their decisions made for them. The consequences extend far beyond individual careers. In democratic societies, voters consistently choose leaders based on how those leaders make them feel rather than on policy effectiveness or leadership competence. Politicians who understand this dynamic craft messages designed to trigger emotional responses rather than rational analysis. They project confidence, authority, and moral certainty because they know most people prefer the comfort of believing in strong leaders over the anxiety of making complex decisions themselves. Meanwhile, you've been taught to evaluate political candidates based on their stated positions and moral character. This well-intentioned approach leaves you vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation by those who understand the gap between public rhetoric and private strategy. You end up supporting leaders based on their ability to perform morality rather than their ability to deliver results. The media landscape amplifies these dynamics exponentially. News organizations understand that fear, outrage, and moral indignation drive engagement more effectively than nuanced analysis or balanced reporting. They craft narratives that make you feel informed while actually keeping you emotionally reactive and intellectually passive. The more strongly you react to news content, the less clearly you think about the underlying power structures creating that content. This creates a feedback loop where your emotional responses to carefully constructed stimuli make you predictable and manageable. Political strategists, marketing professionals, and social media algorithms all exploit your psychological vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that exist precisely because you've never been taught to recognize them. In your personal relationships, this blindness to power dynamics creates recurring patterns of confusion and frustration. You interpret behavior through the lens of morality and good intentions, missing the strategic elements that drive much of human interaction. You assume people mean what they say, that their stated motivations match their actual motivations, and that relationships operate according to principles of fairness and reciprocity. But relationships, like all human interactions, involve complex negotiations over status, resources, attention, and control. Those who understand these dynamics navigate relationships more skillfully, achieve their objectives more consistently, and maintain better boundaries. They recognize when someone is testing their limits, when someone is manipulating their emotions, and when someone is using moral language to disguise self-interested behavior. Your ignorance of these patterns doesn't protect you from them, it makes you vulnerable to them. When you don't understand how power operates in relationships, you become susceptible to guilt manipulation, emotional blackmail, and strategic exploitation by those who do understand these dynamics. The economic consequences are equally significant. In markets, those who understand human psychology and power dynamics consistently outperform those who rely on rational analysis alone. They recognize that financial decisions are often driven by fear, greed, social proof, and authority bias rather than by careful evaluation of objective information. While you try to make smart financial choices based on research and analysis, others are exploiting the predictable irrationality of human behavior. They understand that timing often matters more than accuracy, that perception frequently determines value more than fundamental worth, and that controlling the narrative can be more profitable than controlling the underlying assets. This extends to how entire economic systems function. Central banks, major corporations, and financial institutions operate according to principles that would seem manipulative or unethical if applied by individuals, but which are considered normal and necessary when applied at scale. They manage public perception, influence behavior through strategic communication, and make decisions based on power considerations that have little to do with the moral frameworks governing individual behavior. The most profound consequence of your ignorance about power dynamics is that it keeps you in a perpetual state of moral confusion about the world around you. You see corruption and assume it's an aberration. You see inequality and assume it's accidental. You see manipulation and assume it's temporary. You see strategic behavior and interpret it as character flaws. This moral confusion prevents you from developing effective strategies for navigating a world where power dynamics are constant and inevitable. Instead of learning to recognize and respond to power moves, you remain shocked and dismayed by their existence. Instead of developing your own capacity for strategic thinking, you maintain a naive belief that good intentions and moral behavior will somehow be sufficient. The reality is that power dynamics don't disappear when you ignore them. They simply operate without your awareness or consent. The ethical implications of this are profound. By refusing to understand how power works, you abdicate your responsibility to use power wisely when you have it and to resist power effectively when others use it against you. Those who understand Machiavelli's insights aren't necessarily more moral or immoral than those who don't, but they are more effective at achieving their objectives and protecting their interests. They live in the same world you do, but they see it clearly enough to navigate it skillfully rather than being constantly surprised by outcomes they didn't anticipate. The path to liberation begins with a fundamental shift in perspective that will initially feel like betraying everything you've been taught to value. You must stop viewing power as inherently corrupting and start seeing it as a neutral force that can be used wisely or foolishly, ethically or unethically, effectively or ineffectively. This reframes your entire relationship with influence, strategy, and leadership. Machiavelli understood that power itself is immoral. It's a tool, like fire or language, that becomes good or evil only through its application. The Prince wasn't written to create tyrants. It was written to help leaders understand the true requirements of effective governance so they could choose their methods consciously rather than stumbling through leadership blind to its realities. Your rebellion against ignorance starts with developing what could be called strategic literacy, the ability to recognize power moves, understand their purposes, and respond appropriately rather than just reacting emotionally. This means learning to see beneath surface behaviors to understand underlying motivations, to recognize when someone is testing your boundaries, and to distinguish between genuine moral positions and strategic moral posturing. Consider how this applies to political philosophy in practice. Instead of accepting politicians' statements at face value, you begin analyzing their actions for strategic consistency. You ask, what outcomes do their policies actually create? Who benefits from their decisions? How do their public positions serve their long-term political interests? This isn't cynicism, it's clear-eyed assessment that allows you to make better judgments about who deserves your support. The same analytical approach transforms your understanding of media consumption. Instead of passively absorbing information and emotional triggers, you start asking strategic questions. Why is this story being presented now? What reaction is it designed to create? Who benefits from me thinking and feeling this way? This doesn't mean becoming paranoid or distrustful. It means becoming conscious of how information is used as a tool of influence. In professional environments, strategic literacy means understanding organizational power dynamics instead of just focusing on technical competence. You learn to map informal influence networks, recognize how decisions really get made, and position yourself effectively within existing power structures. This isn't about becoming manipulative, it's about becoming effective at advancing worthy objectives through realistic means. Historical analysis reveals that those who changed the world for the better understood these principles intuitively. They recognized that good intentions without strategic effectiveness often create more harm than help. They learned to build coalitions, manage perceptions, choose battles wisely, and achieve lasting change through methods that worked rather than methods that felt pure. The rebellion requires developing comfort with ethical ambiguity. Real leadership often involves choosing between competing values rather than choosing between good and evil. Effective leaders learn to make decisions that serve long-term objectives even when those decisions create short-term discomfort or moral complexity. This doesn't mean abandoning ethical principles. It means upgrading from naive morality to sophisticated ethics. Instead of rigid rules that ignore context and consequences, you develop judgment that considers both intentions and outcomes, both immediate effects and long-term implications, both individual ethics and collective responsibility. Part of this rebellion involves recognizing when moral language is being used strategically rather than sincerely. Many people have learned to weaponize ethical concepts, using guilt, shame, and moral outrage as tools for manipulation and control. They present their personal preferences as moral imperatives, their strategic positions as ethical requirements, and their emotional reactions as righteous indignation. Learning to recognize this pattern protects you from manipulation while helping you communicate more effectively with others. You can acknowledge someone's moral concerns without accepting their moral conclusions, validate their feelings without accepting their strategic demands, and maintain your ethical standards without being controlled by others' emotional reactions. The rebellion also requires developing your own capacity for strategic thinking rather than just defending against other strategies. This means learning to set long-term objectives, identify necessary resources, build useful relationships, and sequence actions for maximum effectiveness. It means becoming someone who shapes events rather than someone who just responds to them. This involves understanding the power dynamics inherent in every relationship and situation rather than pretending they don't exist. In personal relationships, this means recognizing patterns of influence, reciprocity, and boundary testing. In professional contexts, it means understanding how formal authority interacts with informal influence. In social situations, it means recognizing status dynamics and group psychology. Perhaps most importantly, the rebellion requires accepting responsibility for your own effectiveness in the world. Instead of believing that good intentions are sufficient, you commit to developing the skills necessary to achieve good outcomes. Instead of hoping that truth will prevail automatically, you learn to present truth in ways that actually influence behavior. Instead of assuming that moral people will naturally succeed, you develop the strategic competence necessary to protect and advance your values in a complex world. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it requires ongoing practice and refinement. You must learn to balance strategic thinking with genuine ethics, to use power wisely when you have it, and to respond skillfully when others use power against you. You must develop judgment about when to be direct and when to be subtle, when to collaborate and when to compete, when to accommodate and when to resist. The goal isn't to become cynical or manipulative, it's to become effective at creating positive change in a world where power dynamics are real and constant. It's to develop the wisdom necessary to navigate complexity rather than being paralyzed by it, to make difficult decisions rather than avoiding them, and to achieve meaningful objectives rather than just maintaining comfortable illusions. The deepest truth that Machiavelli revealed, the one that changes everything once you truly understand it, is this: the very distinction between moral and immoral behavior is often a luxury available only to those who don't bear real responsibility for outcomes. When you have no power, when your decisions affect only yourself, when the consequences of your choices are limited and contained, you can afford to operate according to pure moral principles. You can choose honesty even when it's disadvantageous, kindness even when it's taken advantage of, and consistency even when it's strategically foolish. Your moral purity comes at a manageable cost because the stakes are low. But the moment you become responsible for others, for their safety, their prosperity, their future, everything changes. The leader who chooses moral purity over effective action isn't just accepting personal consequences. They're imposing those consequences on everyone who depends on their leadership. The parent who prioritizes being nice over being effective isn't just limiting their own success. They're failing in their fundamental responsibility to prepare their children for reality. This is why Machiavelli focused on rulers rather than private citizens. Those who wield power must navigate ethical dilemmas that those without power never face. They must choose between competing goods, accept trade-offs that have no perfect solutions, and live with consequences that extend far beyond their personal comfort. The ultimate realization is that moral frameworks designed for individuals often become immoral when applied to collective leadership. The virtue of forgiveness becomes the vice of enabling when applied to repeated violations that harm others. The virtue of honesty becomes the vice of naivety when it provides advantage to those who would use truth as a weapon. The virtue of consistency becomes the vice of rigidity when circumstances change and adaptation is required. This doesn't mean that ethics are relative or that anything goes in positions of power. It means that leadership ethics are more complex than individual ethics, requiring sophisticated judgment rather than simple rule following. Effective leaders must develop what could be called consequentialist virtue, the wisdom to choose actions based on their likely outcomes rather than their immediate moral appearance. The political philosophy that emerges from this understanding is neither cynical nor naive. It recognizes that human nature contains both altruistic and selfish impulses, that social systems must account for both tendencies, and that good outcomes often require strategies that work with human nature rather than against it. It accepts that perfect solutions are rare and that choosing between imperfect alternatives is the essence of leadership responsibility. This perspective transforms how you understand power dynamics in every context. In personal relationships, you realize that sometimes protecting someone's feelings in the short term does them harm in the long term. In professional environments, you recognize that sometimes direct confrontation serves collective interests better than polite accommodation. In social situations, you understand that sometimes enforcing boundaries firmly prevents larger conflicts later. The ethical implications of this understanding are profound. Once you recognize that naive morality can lead to harmful outcomes, you become responsible for developing sophisticated ethics. Once you understand that good intentions aren't sufficient for good results, you become obligated to develop effective methods. Once you realize that your moral choices affect others beyond yourself, you must accept the weight of consequential decision-making. This is the ultimate test that Machiavelli presents. Are you strong enough to bear the responsibility of effective action, even when it requires you to act in ways that feel uncomfortable or morally ambiguous? Can you make decisions based on likely outcomes rather than immediate feelings? Can you accept the psychological burden of leadership rather than the psychological comfort of moral purity? The historical analysis reveals that those who passed this test, who accepted responsibility for effectiveness rather than just good intentions, were often the ones who created lasting positive change. They built institutions that protected freedom, defended vulnerable populations from aggressors, and established systems that allowed moral behavior to flourish precisely because they were willing to act strategically when pure morality would have led to failure. The dark truth about power is that it reveals who you really are when the stakes are high enough. It strips away comfortable illusions and forces you to confront the gap between your ideals and your courage to implement them effectively. Most people discover that their moral convictions were weaker than they believed, that their commitment to good outcomes was less than their attachment to feeling good about their methods. But some people discover something else, that genuine ethics require strategic competence, that true compassion demands effective action, and that real virtue includes the wisdom to navigate complexity rather than retreating into simplicity. They learn that the highest morality isn't the purity of individual conscience, but the courage to accept responsibility for collective outcomes. This is the silent code that governs those who shape history rather than just reacting to it. They understand that leadership requires different virtues than followership, that collective responsibility creates different ethical requirements than individual choice, and that effectiveness in service of good ends is itself a moral imperative. The final question Machiavelli poses to you is whether you're willing to grow beyond the moral framework of childhood into the ethical complexity of adult responsibility. Will you remain someone who judges actions by their immediate appearance, or will you become someone who evaluates them by their long-term consequences? Will you preserve your moral comfort, or will you accept the burden of moral effectiveness? Because once you cross this threshold, once you accept responsibility for outcomes rather than just intentions, you join a different category of human being. You become someone who understands that the world is shaped not by those with the purest hearts, but by those with the wisdom and courage to act effectively in service of their deepest values. This is Machiavelli's ultimate gift, not the corruption of innocence, but the transformation of innocence into something more powerful, the strategic wisdom necessary to protect and advance what matters most in a world where good intentions alone are never sufficient, and where the stakes are always higher than your personal comfort with the choices required to win.